Okay, here's a sign-in sheet. We'll finish up mannerism first, and after that we'll talk about the midterm that's on Monday. Right? Sort of some strategies for studying and whatnot. Right? So make sure the sign-up sheet gets its way forward, and we'll wrap up mannerism first. So we were talking about this trend that historians had identified in Italian art after around 1520, give or take, where the ideals and the perfection and the harmony and the balance of Renaissance art that had culminated with Michelangelo and Raphael and Leonardo, that had begun to sort of morph, break down in many ways. So that instead of a rational, unified space, we have this compressed and crowded space, as if there's not quite enough room for all the figures to fit in, to say nothing of the fact that the actual space itself has been limited, or sometimes it's just awkward. It doesn't have that sense of organic unity that we'd seen that grew out of an interest in one-point perspective. So there's a compressing, crowded space. The figures don't have that sense of geometric balance that we saw with Leonardo and Raphael. Figures are often imbalanced. This is particularly evident in the two foreground male figures in the Del Sarto picture on your right, where the infant, originally intended to be Jesus, is almost teetering, where the center of gravity of his body is not placed over his feet. He doesn't have a sense of stability. The figure on the left with the blue cloth wrapped around his waist, which was originally intended to be the Baptist, but changed, he too seems imbalanced as he's precariously kneeling on that green fabric beneath his feet. Right? So imbalance is another part of this. A third part are strange color choices, jarring, artificial, decorative colors. The hot pink and bright lemon yellow of the figure of Charity by Del Sarto, the pinks and greens and electric blues of Bronzino. Extraordinarily colorful, extraordinarily bright, extraordinarily decorative, but they don't have the sense of harmony and balance again that we come to associate with the High Renaissance. So something's going on here, right? And whether the artists are doing it intentionally or not, whether they're rebelling against the High Renaissance artists is a point of debate. But we do see this as a tendency. And not just with these two artists, a tendency that begins in the 1520s. And in the 20th century, art historians labeled this mannerism, because all of these things we're talking about is more artificial, right? More mannered than the art of the High Renaissance. By coincidence, both of the works we're discussing here were gifts from the Grand Duke of Tuscany to the King of France, King Francis I. And as we'll talk about today, King Francis I was a huge patron, sort of a very, very important patron of Mannerist art. He loved all things Italian. And we've mentioned him a couple of times before, right? Wait, hang on a second. I got some slides before we get to that. If the Wi-Fi worked in here, there, right? Awkward anatomies is another part of this, right? Mannerist art, where we don't have, again, just as we don't have a harmonious, unified space, we don't have harmonious, unified bodies either, right? And the body of Cupid in this picture is just so wonky. It just really doesn't articulate at all. And this strange snake-like figure behind Folly, she's supposed to be seen from the back if you figure out where the hands are, right? She's got her back to us. Yet her head is craned around strangely, right? It simply doesn't work, right? And again, crowded in there with these extraordinary colors. They're really beautiful, right? That purple and blue and green and yellow all together. Nice color combination, but they're really jarring at the same time. They're really kind of lurid. And that's part of mannerism. And of course, another part of mannerism is an artificiality that we're talking about, right? That's what mannerism means, is artificiality. Another part of that is sort of the artificiality of a sort of complex allegory, right? The fact that you need this explained to you, right? It's not particularly obvious. It's not like Titian's Venus with the mirror. Pretty straightforward, right? But this is just like, what's going on here? Who's that figure behind the shoulders of Cupid? What is this figure behind Folly, right? What about the figure in the upper left corner? What's with the two doves in the lower left corner, or those masks, those theatrical masks, right behind Venus's feet? All of this it opens up sort of layers and layers of meaning, none of which it really explains very well. It becomes very complicated. And that adds to the sense of artificiality that is a hallmark of Mannerist art, right? Now, as I mentioned, these were gifted to King Francis I, the King of France, who loved all things Italian. He was a huge aficionado of Italian art, and he was the one that Leonardo worked for at the end of his life, right? Remember, Leonardo spent the last roughly 10 years of his life living in France, working for the King of France, and it's because of Francis I that the Mona Lisa is still in Paris, right? Because Leonardo took it with him, because Lisa nor her husband, neither of them wanted it, it seems, right? Or never got it anyway. And he also bought those Michelangelo sculptures that had been abandoned from the project that Michelangelo was working on the tomb of Julius II. So these things all wound up in the collection of King Francis I. He loves Italian art. And these gifts, Venus, Cupid, Folly, and Time, and the allegory of charity that we have at the National Gallery, these things would have added to his growing collection of Italian pictures. And he's very influential, Francis I is, in helping Italian Renaissance, or more accurately, Mannerism. He would have called it Renaissance, right? More accurately, Mannerism to spread through Europe, through his patronage. So, in addition to getting Leonardo, in addition to buying Michelangelo's, in addition to being gifted these Italian pictures, he also hires Italian painters and sculptors to come and work for him as well. So Francis I took this old hunting lodge in the woods outside of Paris, in the forest of Fontainebleau, and he converted it into a sort of a country palace, an extraordinary, sprawling country palace outside of Paris, where he would get away from the city, go hang out there. And as he expanded it, he had it then decorated. And instead of hiring French artists to decorate it, he hires more Italians. He gets the best that he can get his hands on. And he gets two artists, a painter and a sculptor, to come and decorate the Palace of Fontainebleau. And this is Rosso Fiorentino, the redhead of Florence. That's what his name means, right? Rosso Fiorentino. Comes from Florence. He's a painter, right? Mannerist painter. Although, again, to Francis, they didn't know the term Mannerism, right? To Francis, he would have been a Renaissance painter. And Francesco Primaticcio, who is a sculptor and makes those plaster surroundings and also the architectural framework around the picture. And this is one of about 20 to 30 images in this particular room at Fontainebleau, the Gallery of Francis I. It's one of 2 or 3 galleries that Francis had decorated by Italian artists. So he is actively importing the Renaissance, right? But by the time he does it, 1520s, 1530s, the Renaissance had shifted to this more awkward, strange, fantastic, imbalanced, crowded Mannerist style, right? And that's what comes to Fontainebleau. So in this case, the painting itself shows knowledge conquering ignorance. It's an allegory, right? And as we might expect from a Renaissance allegory, it's going to be fairly complicated. And in addition to that, the figures that appear here have all of the hallmarks of the Mannerist style. The space is compressed, compacted, the figures are crowded, the anatomies are artificial. Some of that began with Michelangelo, right? There's something, David's too perfect. You know, it may be unified, but nobody really ever looked like that, right? Here they become more strapping, more burly. steroided, right? Like Mickey Rourke in The Wrestler or something, right? Just so overly big, right? And the colors are bright, decorative, sometimes jarring, and the symbolism is complicated. All of this adds to an artificiality that Francis I loved. And I'll tell you this, I've never really gotten into the Palace at Fontainebleau as a historian looking at this stuff, simply because there are reams and reams of paper that have been written about what these things mean, because they're so complicated that we still are not 100% sure, right? It's still really open to debate. So Francis has this new palace with all of these decorations, and when people came to visit him, they wanted their own versions to take home. They wanted mementos, right, of the trip, souvenirs. And so what Francis I had was a printmaking studio at the Palace of Fontainebleau that would make copies of these for visitors, like postcards, right? We go to the National Gallery and buy a postcard, right? Or anywhere you might go, the Louvre, and you buy yourself a Mona Lisa, take it home with you, right? And we've got mechanical reproduction, so you can get them for pennies, you know? But back then they would go to France and say, okay, fine. I'll give you variations of these. And so he had a whole printmaking shop that was making copies of the main scenes that people could buy and collect. And you could have in a book your own version of the Palace at Fontainebleau. And parts of it have been renovated, and this helps us to understand what was originally there. So here is a print, an engraving, and we've talked about engravings before, right, with Dürer. Yeah? Also, we saw some with Bruegel as well, right? We saw some engravings from him as well, where you cut into a piece of metal, right? You use a piece of steel to cut into a piece of softer metal like copper. Then you rub the carving with ink, right? And the ink stays inside the lines, and then you put a piece of paper on it, you press it, and you get the print in reverse, right? And you can make multiples from one matrix, which is nice, because then you can make, each one of us can go and buy one, right? So here's the same scene, the Conquest of Innocence, that we see painted here in one of these sort of souvenir versions, collectible souvenir versions, in a print by René Boivin, who was one of the numerous printmakers that were hired by Francis I to replicate these designs, right? And this gives us an opportunity to look at it better, because I've not been able to find a good close-up of the color, right? That's as good as I'm going to get. One of these days I'm going to get there with my own camera and we'll take care of this, right, for classes. But now we'll look at the print. And so as we read the image, right, first as a Mannerist image, notice the compressed space, right? We have foreground and then just sort of clouds and nothing else behind it. And in the foreground, all the figures are extraordinarily crowded together into this huge jumble, right, mashed against each other. There's a pile of bodies on the right. And as we look at that pile of bodies on the right, we can see that, in fact, the anatomies are a little on the goofy side, which is typical for Mannerist art. It's one of the hallmarks of the style. So if you look at this figure here, and again, these are all meant to be ignorant people, right? So they're all blindfolded to show their ignorance. If we look at their, it's kind of like the blind leading the blind. He's got him by the hand, so let's go this way. But you're following somebody who doesn't know what the heck they're talking about. And if we look at the body of the chubby fellow here with the stick, with his mouth open, right? You'll notice that he's got these big burly shoulders, but then he's just trying to figure out how it all fits, right? How do the shoulders and the chest and the torso then fit with the hips and the legs? And you realize that it doesn't really articulate it in a unified, organic way, in a way that we would expect from like a Leonardo or a Michelangelo, right? It just doesn't quite mesh together. And as we look at other images here, the figure here, look at that back. Look at the way it's like a pile of mashed potatoes or something, right? I mean, they're emphasizing the muscles to the point where they become unrealistic. And again, that's a hallmark of Mannerist style, right? And another hallmark is a certain eroticism that we saw with the Venus, Cupid, Folly, and Time, and Francis I seems to like this as well. So as our figures are blindly flailing about, right, these are ignorance personified, one of them is grabbing someone inappropriately, right? So this really is a hallmark of Mannerist style, right? that we see throughout this work. And then there's the symbolism of the piece. So as we read through it, we see that the figures here are moving in a particular direction as we move. Sorry, that didn't change. There we go. We see that there's a building on the left, and on the far left of it, there are more ignorant figures, a woman and a child, and a figure at her hip. And above it, it says a word in Latin, mali, which means sin, evil. Right? Where does ignorance lead? It leads to darkness, just like the blindfolds, and it leads to bad behavior, mali. And within all of this, there is one figure who is bathed in light, carrying a sword and walking into a well-lit gateway, where above it, it says Iostius Lovis, and Jovis, sorry. And this is the portal of Jupiter. Jupiter, the god of wisdom, right? The king of the heavens. So the one figure with a book under his arm and a sword in his hand has figured it out. He is knowledge who has conquered ignorance. And that would account then for the sword, right? Is that he's conquering ignorance. And he's moving into the light, right? Now, this is not all immediately obvious, right? Because part of this takes a back seat to the sort of decorative jumble of figures in the foreground. But again, that's a hallmark of mannerism, is that a picture like this you couldn't get on your own. You would need a guidebook. You would need someone to help you understand it. It's been suggested that the figure moving into the light is a portrait of Francis I. This is a portrait of Francis I. And I don't know, maybe if he's got that nose, that long hawk-like nose, perhaps that might have made him very happy, right, as the patron of the piece, to see himself as the one whose knowledge has conquered ignorance. But there's really no proof for this, no sort of smoking gun this way. But this is certainly a suggestion, right, that this would have pleased him in his palace. So remember that this is a print that is a reproduction of a fresco done by Italian artists for Francis I. That's helping now to translate mannerism outside of Italy to the rest of Europe. In Italy, right, even Michelangelo was affected by this new style. After 1520, we began to see, again, the harmony, the idealization of the Renaissance breakdown. And Michelangelo, who had been one of our prime representatives of the High Renaissance, after 1520, his works start to go in kind of the same direction, where they're strange, they're weird, where the space is compressed, right? So in this case, there's just foreground. It's like everybody's on a curtain that's hanging there, and there's no sort of foreground background. It's just up and down. And you have a worksheet, right, that dealt with this. But if we look at the body types that Michelangelo is using later in his career, they're mannerist, they're awkward. Look at Jesus, it just doesn't work. Look at how big he's got, right? He's just spreading laterally. He's not getting fat. He's just getting too big for skin, oversized. And then try to figure out how that extraordinary torso, burly, right, works with those tiny little hips and the legs. And if you just do this with your hand, cover up the torso. And the legs kind of look okay, right? Covered up down to the loincloth, right? And the lower legs look okay. And then you cover up the bottom, cover up his legs from the loincloth down, and the torso kind of looks okay. But then you look at them together, and there's something, the spine doesn't match the hips, And in addition to that, he's neither seated nor standing. It's again a sort of a crowded, slippery, imbalanced pose. The Virgin Mary under his elbow also has that same issue, except she's got a tiny torso and huge hips, right? But there's, again, almost like there's not enough space for her, as if she's barely clinging on to that cloud that's supporting Jesus, right? These are mannerist hallmarks, and even with Michelangelo, we see them. They're sliding off their clouds, crowded so much together that there's really not enough room for everybody. And these anatomies that are based on observation but have become increasingly artificial, right? This is mannerism in in a nutshell. Our last Mannerist artist that we'll look at is El Greco. And El Greco, his name means the Greek. Let's just see this name. Domenicos Theotokos. There's too many syllables in there for me, right? Was born in Crete, right, near Greece. Native Greek speaker, trained in Italy, right? Went and apprenticed under artists in Italy, and then moved to Spain, which is where he spent the most productive part of his career, was working in Spain. So he's our first artist really active in Spain that we've looked at in this class. And this particular picture that we have is one of two in the National Gallery that he painted let's see. Yeah, one of two in the National Gallery that came from the same chapel in Spain, where he was living, right in the city of Toledo. And it shows the Madonna and Child up above in heaven, surrounded by angels. Two saints down below, the named saints of the chapel, right? Agnes and Martina. Agnes always carries a lamb. It's because lamb in Latin is Agnus, right? So that's her name saint. And Martina over here, her symbol is the lion. I don't even exactly know why, right? But she carries a martyr's palm. This signifies that she died for her faith, right? And El Greco's signs, interestingly, right on the head, the forehead of the lion is part of El Greco's signature, right? So this was done while he was in Spain after having trained in Italy, right? In Italy, we know that he trained under Titian. We talked about Titian before, in Venice. And the reason for this is that Crete was part of the Venetian Republic. It was part of the Venetian Empire. Right? So Venice controlled the island of Crete where El Greco was born. This would make a logical first stop for him, would be to move to Venice rather than to Rome or to Florence. And in Venice, he studies under Titian much, much later in Titian's life. Titian lives to be about 95, right? And El Greco winds up with Titian much later. But at the same time, he would have seen earlier Titians that were still on display. Like this one, which we haven't looked at before, but this is a fairly early Titian. He's about 25 or so when he paints this. A massive altarpiece in the Franciscan church in Venice. Must be 25, 30 feet tall. That's huge. And it shows the Virgin Mary being taken into heaven at the end of her life. Right? God up above, the apostles down below. Ooh la la, right? Hands in the air. Now, if we see these side by side, you can start to see where he's picking up the structure of the composition from Titian. Right? We've got heaven up above, a bit of a break, and earthly figures down below. Right? As if Martina and Agnes are having this vision of the Virgin and Child that opens up in the clouds above them. That's sort of derived out of Titian's work. But at the same time, it begins to sort of illustrate what is mannerism about mannerism. So with Titian, you'll notice that the image of the Virgin going to heaven becomes a circle, right? It's sort of a perfect form, balanced, symmetrical, right? And the circle almost as if it's plotted over the heaven that's right above her head, right? So heaven is this perfect circle. There's an easy break, and then the sort of figures down below who are very naturalistic still very, very realistic, right? And then with El Greco, it sort of spills out. Our Titian's Virgin has plenty of space for her to stand. She's stable on top of that cloud. The angels sort of break the spaces together. But here, it's almost as if she's spilling out of them. And there's these little heads of angels down below. But there's not enough room for her there. That she's not really as stable. And that's a hallmark of mannerism. The colors are much more lurid, much more bright. There's something about El Greco's work that looks like it's lightning or strobe light effect. He loves to highlight with white and bring in those zinging whites that really kind of electrify the image and charge it with a significant amount of energy. But everywhere we look in the image, we see that things don't seem particularly well balanced. Jesus seems to be slipping off of her lap as he grabs onto her finger. There's that motif we've seen so many times, right? Jesus grabbing the Virgin Mary's finger. Going all the way back to John, right? Yeah, beginning and end, we got the exact same thing, right? But if we look at him on her lap, it's like there's not enough room there. And then look what happens with that other leg, right? It's so chubby, the one on your left, underneath your hand. Where it's not so much worrying about the articulation of the bones and the structure underneath and the anatomical study, but it's more about the sort of decorative surface quality of shapes playing with each other. When we looked at Titian, we talked about how he left brushwork unblended, and El Greco's doing the same thing. Learning that from his master, highlighting whites everywhere. Colors have this extraordinary sort of decorative quality, that lemon lime green that the figure of this angel has. Again, odd inaccuracies, like Klingon ears or something. Like they're fake ears that the angel is wearing. They don't really fit with the anatomy of the angel. This is all, again, mannerism in a nutshell. And then, especially with El Greco, are the anatomies, right? His anatomies tend to be elongated. And this is really true for almost all of his figures. They're stretched. They're thinner. When we talk about mannerism and artificial body types, which we've seen in almost every mannerist picture, some of them get big and burly, like Michelangelo. Some of them get disjointed, like Bronzino. And for El Greco, it's different. It's this elongation that gives it a sort of elegance, the length of St. Agnes's fingers, the length of her neck. This is another sort of mannerist artificiality to the body type, right, that pushes it in this more decorative direction. Right? So that's the long and the short of it for mannerism. This is the primary style of the late 16th century, not only in Italy but spreading everywhere. Right? It is mannerism. Some people even talk about Peter Bruegel, right, as being kind of a northern mannerist, because his body types are strange, and sometimes the spaces are artificial. That foreground and the distant background, there's not much in between, right? So this breakdown of Renaissance ideals that we're talking about here can be seen on one hand as a generation sort of rebelling against the previous generation, which is normal. Don't do what Dad did, right? On the other hand, many people have tied it to the unrest in Europe that we talked about on Monday, right? That European politics, European social structures are sort of a mess in the late 16th century, and that could have everything to do with it as well. Okay. And that's the end of the slideshow. What I want to talk about, because we still have some time left, although I'm trying to ward off this cold that I've had. I want to talk about the midterm next. And I wanted to mention one thing is that I got rid of one of the slides on the slide list. There was a slide by Tintoretto there. That is no longer there. So it's down by one. I've updated it. Here, let's just do this. Give me a second. I'm going to change my screen. There we are. Okay. So I've updated the study guide. Or excuse me, the slide list. Sorry about that. I gotta fix that. Okay. Did I not add a new one? I'll fix the link. Why is that being there? Okay. Right. So you can see I struck through Tintoretto. Right. So you don't need to know that one, just for interest of time. So now we're down to, I think, 28 slides all told, is what you need to know. Okay. In studying for the exam, here are the important things. The first thing you should be trying to do, right, is commit these images to memory. Right? There are 28 images, And as I recommended a week ago when we first started talking about this, the best thing you can do is to make flashcards, right? And I have put up on Canvas, right, a PowerPoint with all of the slides. And it's here both as a PowerPoint and as a PDF. So in making your flashcards, what you want to make sure you do is don't tell yourself the answer with the flashcard. That's the whole point of flashcards, right? Is that you put the thing you need to know on one side and the stuff you need to know about it on the other side, so that you're not just giving yourself the answers, right? So what I did when I was sitting where you were, after I got like a C- on my first art history midterm, what I did was I figured I needed to do something. I made flashcards, and I went from a C- to an A- to an art historian by trade. And I'm not recommending that's where you're going, right? But if you wanted to get better grades, this works, and has, for 30 years of teaching, has helped students invariably, is to make flashcards. Print this out, get rid of the information on the front, and write on the back of it what you need to know about it. Giotto, Madonna and Child, early 14th century, and the period it came from, Proto-Renaissance, right? And then what I did was I made them all the same size and just put them on, 3x5s, note cards with a Yoo-hoo glue stick. I shuffled it, I went through it, I wrote it down. Even if I thought I knew it, I wrote it down. And the reason for this is that, again, psychological tests have proven that when you write, you learn, right? If you just say it out loud, you are not replicating the way that the test will be given to you. You are not going to be asked to say it out loud. So it doesn't matter if you can't say Giotto, right? Giotto. That's what you got to write down. So I went through it until my arm was sore. Went through the pack, writing down the answers, committing everything to memory. That's a great first step. If I knew it, if I got it right the first time, I put it aside. If I didn't get it right, it went back into the deck. And I went through it until they were all gone. And then I went through it one more time to make sure. That's an important step. That's not all the exam will be about, but it will make all the rest of your review stronger. It will make the rest of it make sense to you. Okay? So commit the slides to memory. That's step number 1. Step number 2, let's see if this is still up there. That's still not coming up, so hang on a second. Exam 1, study sheet. Why is that not showing up? There it comes. Right? Step number 2, look at the terms. Spend some time with the terms. Determine the meaning. Determine which works of art they relate to. So, for example, with the major cities and sites, or the patrons on the right, who does Duke Ludovico Sforza of Milan relate to? Leonardo da Vinci. Right? He was his patron in Milan. What is his genre scene? Who was Giorgio Vasari? Why is he important to us? Right? Why is the city of Dijon important to what we've learned? You don't need to know all of the Wikipedia history of the city of Dijon, or how many people live there now, right? How is it relevant to what we've learned? So again, with this, you might make flashcards, right? But the more that you can write it, the more it will make sense. Okay? So those are the first 2 things with the study sheet, right? Know those slides on sight. Determine the meaning of the different terms and how they relate to the works of art we've been dealing with. After you've done that, go back to your notes and read them for sure. But if you've got the time, nothing helps like revising them. Make the notes make sense to you, right? Because as you're writing them, they're in the order that I presented things, right? So reorganize them. If you do that, you'll be engaging with the material of the course, and you will be helping, again, to step from being exposed to it to actually learning it. And that's a really important part of this, is get past from initial exposure to learning the information. And it doesn't just happen, right? It requires active participation on your part. So to learn the material, go back and engage with your notes. Rewrite them. Make them make sense to you. Right? In this case, you've got them handwritten. Now's a good time to pull out your computer. Right? Because then you block and copy things around. Make them make sense to you. For this, I would highly recommend using the study guide. Because remember with the study guide, we've got a series of questions about the works. Can we all see it okay? Right? You could use this to reorganize your notes. Ask yourself these questions. You may not be able to answer them all, but you should be able to answer some of them about each work. Right? Revise your notes. The first thing, right, dates are tough. People have trouble with dates. That's why I've tried to make it easier by making it early or late century. But maybe make a timeline. Make a list of who's active in the early 15th century versus the late 15th century. Who's active in Italy versus the Netherlands versus France versus Germany. Right? Make a timeline. That'll help you deal with the dates. I want to go back to this for a second, right? Okay, that didn't work. There it comes. I think, yeah. Okay. Sorry about the speed. So, think about mnemonic devices. About 20 years ago, I had some students who were chatting with me after class was over, and they said, if it's weeping, it's widen. Right? They just made these mnemonic devices. W-E-E-W-E-Y. Made sense to them. If it's a weeping, it's a widen. So, any other things that you can use in the way of sort of mnemonic devices that can help you to remember things, right? Not only timelines, but other issues, right? But again, make it make sense to use. Use the study guide to answer questions. And the best essays are always the essays that talk not only about what's in the picture, which is one thing, but what surrounds the picture, its original context, right? So on the essays, short and long, you don't have to limit yourself to describing what's there in front of your eyes. It's also understanding something about the image that I've been trying to teach you, about how it fits into a broader context. So, in addition to talking about the subject matter, you should also be able to talk about who made the work. What do we know about Roger van der Weyden? That could be something that could enter into your essay. Right? On the study sheet, it asks who influenced him, who did he influence? Those could be things you could mention. Those would be things you could talk about. In class, we talked about the fact that he apprenticed under Robert Campan, and that the face of his Virgin looks like the face of this one. So even though that's not on the screen, when you're talking about the work on the left, you could talk about that issue. That shows me you know something more about the work than having seen it for the first time ever. Right? If your essay consists of things like there's a man in red on the left, and the Virgin is wearing blue, but doesn't go any further than that, that doesn't show me that you know a whole lot about what's going on in the picture. If you tell me that the Virgin is wearing blue because the color is symbolic of royalty, faithfulness to Christ's cause, right, that shows me you know more about it. Right? If you tell me that the Virgin Mary's face looks very similar to his teacher, Robert Campbell, that tells me you know something about the work of art. Right? If you tell me the way in which she falls mirrors the pose of her son, that's great, but then go a step further and tell me why. Why does the Virgin's pose reflect the pose of her son? Because the pain he feels, she's feeling too. And that would have been important for the people who commissioned it, who were devoted to her character as the Virgin of Sorrows. Right? The sorrow of the Virgin is the theme. So think about who made it. Think about why it was made. Right? Who paid for it. Right? The patron often gets to choose so much of what's going on in the work itself. How did that affect what we're seeing here? So in this case, we knew the patron, the Crossbowmen's Guild for the city of Leuven, right next to Brussels where Roger was stationed, where he worked. They were dedicated to the Sorrowful Virgin. They're the reason Roger chose the composition he did. They're also the reason why the Virgin and Jesus look like little crossbows, or big crossbows, right, in the body forms that they have, right? Think about where it was originally seen, right? These are things that you could comment on. Where did this originally appear, right? If you got Michelangelo's David, right, originally it was intended for part of the cathedral, but then it was moved in front of the city hall because Florence sees themselves as David. Right? That affects our knowledge of the piece. That shows me you know more about it than just describing what's on the screen. Right? That should lead us to a deeper level of analysis. Right? What does it depict? In this case, you could talk specifically about what's in front of us here. Christ being lowered from the cross after the crucifixion, the Virgin fainting. But then again, try to tie that to what the patron might have wanted, how that might have affected a viewer seeing this in its original context. Okay. And then think about style. What differentiates late Gothic work, Northern Europe, right, the Netherlands, from early Renaissance work in Italy at exactly the same time? Right? The best discussions will talk about these things, what's in the work and what's surrounding it. When I was a grad student, we had to do a comprehensive oral exam, right, where they had. This is for the PhD. They wanted to know if you knew what you were doing, and what you got was a semester where all you did was study for this one exam, right? And you had to. It wasn't like everything from caves to computers. You got to pick and choose, right? And it's an impossible test to ace because you can't know everything, right? And you might look at this test as an impossible test to ace, although people do ace it, right? One of the things that I decided I had to do, right, to pass, to do well, to do more than pass, to do well, was I figured since I may not know everything and I might not remember the date on this thing, or even some of the details about the Crossbowmen's Guild, I had a default answer for everything. So when I got shown a Roger van der Weyden, I had to sort of default. This is what I'll say about Roger van der Weyden. If I can't think of anything else to say, I'll say this, because I know that stuff, right? So what would you say about late Gothic art if you knew it was late Gothic, but you didn't know anything, you couldn't remember anything else? You had it in that period. What is typical, characteristic for late Gothic art? Realism of details. Crucial, right? Sort of a topographical description of things. That's typical of late Gothic art. What's typical of the High Renaissance? Stability, perfection, harmony and unity. right? What's typical of early Renaissance? Beginnings of the use of one-point perspective, right? Think of these things that you can add, and that way, if a Masaccio comes up and you don't know what to do with it, Donatello comes up, you've got something to say, which is better than nothing to say, right? Because the test is not about finding out where you screw up. That's not what the point of the point of the test is to find out what you do know. So when it comes to an essay, don't ever leave it blank. Unlike for those of you in health professions, right? Wrong answers are worse than no answers in the health professions because a wrong answer means you've misdiagnosed somebody, and that's horrible, right? That means you give them drugs for things that'll kill them. But art history, nobody dies. So don't leave things blank. A guess is, if it's wrong, is the same, right? Mark off as a nothing. And who knows? Maybe you'll luck out, right? Say something about it. It's better than nothing. So review your notes, revise your notes, use the different things you have. You've got a slide sheet. You've got now a PowerPoint with all the pictures on it. You've got a study sheet. You've got almost all of the lectures recorded. A couple of little gaffes happened, right? Last class, somehow the video didn't record. I think it's because I started it before I started the slideshow, right? And we had one where it fell apart, but you can go back and play every single lecture or almost every single lecture and look at your notes that way if something is unclear, right? You've got the notes that you took in class. You've got all of these different things that you can use to succeed at the midterm, right? But remember that as you're discussing the works, not only are you going to be identifying things, but you're going to be then trying to analyze them. Use a description to lead to an analysis, right? We're always asking why. Why did they include this, right? Not just identifying what's there, but then what does it mean, right? Why was it included? How does it relate to the context of the piece? Okay. I haven't written it yet because I didn't know what I was going to get today. It should time around 50 to 55 minutes. That's usually where it falls. That gives you 20 minutes at the end to go back. The slides come up in a timed sequence that over 30 years of teaching has given 95% of the people ample time, and usually about 50% have too much time, right, to do it. But all of the slides will be printed on a write-on exam, so you can go back and or you can move ahead or move back by looking at the thumbnail that's there, right? The write-on exam will be black and white. It's too expensive to print it in color, right? My dean will get mad at me if I printed it in color. But the slides will appear up here large, right, in color. In the last 20 minutes, we can go back and see things. You've got a mock exam, also on Canvas, to show you what the structure will be like, the sorts of things you might expect. It'll be longer than that, right? But again, you'll have the entire hour and 15 to write as much as you can. The last thing I'll mention this again on Monday. Over the years I've been teaching, I find that the people who write the most do the best. Write as much as you possibly can. And think about writing as a way of spurring your memory. Because sometimes you might write a few lines that don't get us anywhere, but all of a sudden, oh yeah, that's right. I remember now. This, right? On the right is a woman with red sleeves, and she's wringing her hands, and oh yeah, it's Mary Magdalene, right? And oh yeah, the cleavage signals her past, right? And there we're somewhere, even though a woman on the right in red sleeves doesn't get us very far, right? The writing can lead us to thinking, and that's the important thing for the exam. So I'm looking now for you to show me what you've learned over the first 7 weeks of class, right? 6-7 weeks of class. And my desire, health permitting and everything else, that you'll get it back on Thursday, right? So you'll take it on Monday, have it back on Thursday. Okay? Any questions about all of this? It's an awful lot of stuff. You got the weekend to cram, right? I will start prompt at 8. So people who often come in late, you're going to come in, don't come in late on Monday, right? Try to get here early, okay? Because it'll get started without you, right? It'll be difficult to be able to answer questions before 8 o'clock on Monday, but I should be here. I usually get here around 6:30 or 6:45. So I should be in my office if you have any last-minute questions. Over the weekend, yeah, I might be able to answer emails. It's hard to say for sure, right? So if you begin to cram, better to ask me questions today and tomorrow about that, right? But this is then on Monday. One last thing, since we got a little bit of time, is that if you don't do poorly on the midterm and you do fantastic on the final, your grade will not be a simple average of the two, right? But that doesn't mean you should blow it off, right? The people who get the best grades in class will do well on both. Okay? All right then, good luck to you studying. And yeah, let me know if you have any questions as you're doing it by email.